Outrage against the system got Donald Trump elected. Will outrage against the system get him voted out in 2020? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. The U.S. president's row with Twitter, a reminder that 2016 was dubbed by some a Facebook election. Donald Trump at the time able to reach citizens who don't usually vote with tailored messaging. In some instances, also discouraging the other side from casting ballots. Throughout his tenure, the U.S. president has kept his supporters energized with a steady diet of insurgent outrage, broadcast over Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms. Now, are we witnessing a turning point? Are the outraged who are trumpeters suddenly outnumbered by those outraged over George Floyd? The sharing over social media of one video, that of a 46-year-old African-American's death at the hands of Minneapolis police, sparking worldwide uproar over racism and police brutality. The power of Silicon Valley in this instance is such that the outrage has spread globally to places like Paris or Bristol in southwest England, where protesters over the weekend took down the statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston. They saw that same video of George Floyd over the same social media that are U.S. owned and that play by U.S. rules. So we'll be asking about Twitter's decision to filter, or if you look at it a different way, censor tweets by Donald Trump, and why Facebook, owner of WhatsApp and Instagram, chose to distance itself from Twitter. On that score, could 2020 still be a Facebook election? And will the momentum still switch back to the incumbent in the White House? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what may or may not be a turning point for not just Donald Trump, but also social media. And with us to talk about it, filmmaker Zachary James Miller, who is a member of Democrats Abroad France. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Francois.
We also want to welcome Anthony Sanders from St. Paul, Minnesota. Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. The Institute for Justice, in a word, a group of lawyers that advocate free speech.
That's right. Amongst other liberties, we litigate about free speech and Americans' right to criticize the government.
And with us as well, Marie-Andrée Weiss, a New York attorney specializing in social media regulation, who joins us from St. Petersburg, Florida. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, François. Thank you.
We also are pleased to welcome back sociologist Davina Frau-Meg, a professor of media sociology at Paris's Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Among your latest books in French, Should We Be Scared of Fake News? Do you want to give a spoiler here, Davina? Should we be scared of fake news?
You have to wait till the end of the program, François.
Okay. Well, I'll be tuning in then. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. The striking image over the weekend was, those barriers that got put up around the White House, suddenly transformed by protesters who posted on them grievances and messages. You've had the narrative shift quite a bit in the space of a week, Zachary James Miller. There was the initial outrage, then there was the looting and the riots that were violent at times, and now all these images over social media of instances where there's been police brutality, coupled with those pictures like the ones you saw outside the White House.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting time. I think we live in interesting times, as a proverb goes. But I think this is a pivot. We reached a tipping point, and I think that's a good thing. I think the tragedies can amount to something being changed. What's happening now is not unlike, events of 1968 that, we can go back to. But I think that it's a positive point, and that we have to.
1968, where there was what was called a long hot summer with race riots throughout the United States. And 1 week ago, the conversation was, is violence justified? Without violence, can you get attention? Now, when you look at those images outside the White House, it's changed a lot in a week.
It has. For the most part, the protests have been massive and peaceful. And we also don't know the individuals that incited violence. I mean, not all of those individuals that incited the violence were part of the peaceful protests. There's lots of information coming out about other factions that have infiltrated the protests to create that kind of atmosphere and to create that violence. So I think that's important to first, be aware of that. But yeah, I think the momentum is there, and I think the message is being heard loud and clear.
Well, Anthony Sanders, you're, I guess, what you could say at the epicenter of it all, since what sparked all the outrage happened in Minneapolis, right next door to you. How do you explain, or how do you describe how the mood has changed in the United States and where you are just in the space of 10 or 12 days?
Yeah, well, I think that what has happened in the last few days shows the power of exercising our freedom of speech. Whether that's over Twitter, whether that's over Facebook, or more traditional means, people have been outraged by this shocking video, and understanding that video isn't a one-off, that there's a lot of history of a lack of police accountability in the country, and this has just become more and more known. And so these protests are a manifestation of people trying to some way get a message to our leaders that there needs to be change. There needs to be, for example, a change in our qualified immunity doctrine in the United States, which shields bad police from doing bad things to people, and a number of other legal doctrines that our leaders can change, but that they've been shielded from for so long because there hasn't been this public awakening. And I'm hoping that will lead either in the courts or in the legislatures to addressing the lack of police accountability.
Is that public awakening down to social media?
I think in a very large part, yes, because social media allows people to directly connect to each other in a way that people have always been able to do, of course, but the institutional media before the internet age allowed for some filtering and a lack of that speech. Now, I think it could have happened in past times. I mean, in the pamphleting age of the founding of the country, there was of course opportunity for social awakening. What I think we want to be worried about, though, is the growing call on both the right and the left to regulate this speech and to regulate how our speech is conducted over social media. I think that's very dangerous, and I think it would allow for the government to prevent things such as this awakening of the last few days, and we need to be very cognizant of that.
Marie-André Weiss, you agree?
Yeah, I do. It was very concerning last week to read that President Trump finally published its executive order. It has been some news. I mean, we heard last year that he may actually issue such an order, and finally he didn't do it. But then he finally published it and signed it following his ongoing battle with Twitter.
Let's just remind our viewers for a second here. Donald Trump reacting to the filtering of a couple of his tweets at the end of last month, in particular the one where he talked about thugs being out in the streets, and also where he said, when the looting begins, the shooting begins, echoing what had been said in 1967 by the racist police chief in Miami, not too far from where you are. The decree lifts immunity for social media platforms that follow the same sort of rules as traditional publishers. In other words, since 1996, correct me if I'm wrong, Marie-André, the social media platforms have been exempt from following the same rules as other publishers in media.
Yeah, the Communication Decency Act was enacted in 1996. It was to actually prevent a platform, at the time it wasn't social media, it was maybe more, other platform on the web, to be held responsible for content published on the platform. And it was a famous case, Zeron versus American Online, where a man it was almost a defamation case, in a sense. He has been accused of selling goods related to the bombing, 1995 bombing in, gosh, where was it again? I don't of the federal buildings. And so then
in Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma, yes, of course. And so what the CDA said is that the platform cannot be held liable if they delete content in good faith. That's one thing. And also they protect they also say they protect them if
of course, 1996 was a very long time ago. You mentioned AOL at the time was involved.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
This is Facebook didn't exist, Twitter didn't exist, Snapchat didn't exist. Do the same rules apply today?
Yeah, they still do, and it has been a very important law for social media, because if you publish something on social media, Facebook, Twitter is not liable for what you are saying. And on the other hand, if they decide to take down the content, they're not liable either. So you have to understand there's two protections.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
I think it's good. I mean, without that, I don't think social media could have functioned. And so President Trump, and I'm not the only one saying that, when he issued the executive order, may have opened a can of worms, and we don't know where it's going. The thing is, the executive order as it is probably won't lead to anything, but presidential candidate, so Joe Biden is now the official candidate for the Democratic Party, and he has been on record saying he will also change the CDA. So it seems that we're leading, whether we have Donald Trump as president in next year or Joe Biden, the CDA is probably will be modified or from one way or another, and hopefully maybe not the way Donald Trump has in mind right now.
Divine Framegs, how do you understand the way Donald Trump has in mind? And should there be more regulation of social media platforms? Should they be considered publishers?
Good point. Well, I think to backtrack a little bit, is it a tipping point or not? I think we are at a tipping point because we see for the first time a real convergence between what I call the information contract of the traditional media and the sharing contract of the social media. Both are denouncing what's happened to Floyd, etc., as a scandal. And usually that's what the sharing contract does. There's a scandal, we should advocate for change, and then we look for solutions. Whereas media in general analyze an issue, ask for experts, and then also look for solutions. This time, both social and heritage media are coming together. That's very important in terms of opinion change. Research shows that opinion changes when all the media within one trend change opinions, and then it goes across all media. And we've seen Fox aligning with all the other media channels now in rebuking Trump. And now we're seeing that this is going to the social media and across all of them sharing the images that we've seen and that are scandalous images. And Trump has sensed that. He senses there is an opinion change against him because he has misbehaved with the COVID crisis, with his lack of compassion, with the crimes at the moment and what's happening in the streets. So he's done what is called in political punditry, he's walked through the Overton window from Joseph Overton's idea of what is viable as political ideas. And what he's doing is that he's criticizing the social media to curtail their fire and to expose them to the hatred of his followers and to be the champion of free speech, because it's in the name of free speech that he is actually trying to curtail that, which is typical Trump, very paradoxical, but very powerful.
And Divina, seen from Paris, right? This idea that free speech, the First Amendment, it's very American. It's not French, this concept of free speech. So the fact that he wants to perhaps treat these social media platforms as publishers, can that be seen as a good thing?
Well, he is, of course, feeding into the agenda. So he looks as if he was twisting things, but that's the Overton window. He is now setting the debate on what has been going on the right and on the left. And there's something odd going on, too much fake news. This is misleading the whole of the democratic process. And there's been pushover for codes of conduct. That's the European position about the social media. I've been part of the task force that has set up this code of conduct of platforms, that they should be careful about some contents that are controversial, hate speech, etc. And so he's sensing that, and he's using it on his own terms. And he is encouraging, in that window that he has opened, of political discourse, he's now encouraging a lot of dissent. It doesn't matter. It gives people the impression that they are free to speak about all their opinions, for and against, but he's sending the message to his constituency: I'm the one who's setting the agenda, I'm the one in power unilaterally, and this is now going to happen. It was going to happen, I agree with all of you, that there is going to be a regulation coming up, whichever way. It's for us and for American people to make sure that it remains within acceptable, tolerable democratic rules. But it's happening. And he wants to be in charge, and he wants to be the champion of free speech, which is the talk of the alt-right. So he is actually speaking only to his constituency, in my opinion.
I want to bring in Zachary James Miller, but first, your thoughts on what Davina Frau-Meggs just said, Anthony Sanders. Do you agree with her that he's speaking the language of the alt-right when he says Twitter is wrong to filter his posts?
Well, I am not a credentialed psychologist, so I don't want to try and read the president's mind. And I don't know if anyone really wants to try to read that man's mind. What I will say is that free speech is still a value that Americans value across the board, from the right to the left. Some have little different understandings of it, but it's something that Americans cherish. And if the president is speaking to perhaps a not so savory element of American society, that doesn't mean that free speech itself isn't a value that is amongst many liberties, unfortunately, which are not enforced by our federal judiciary. Free speech is one that is.
So when the president of the United States posts a tweet, because the initial row, remember, was about voter suppression, posts a tweet that's factually incorrect, or when the president of the United States sends what could be considered a dog whistle message that's inciting to violence, when he talks about when the looting starts, the shooting starts, is Twitter right to flag it?
Well, Twitter is a private entity and is absolutely within its rights to either flag it or take it down or block, delete the president's account. It can do whatever it wants in that regard. And that's something we need to remember, is that this signing state, this executive order of the president's, and I completely agree, this executive order itself is rather toothless and is mostly just a bunch of bluster. The sentiments there about how Twitter and Facebook and other entities should be regulated gets it backwards. Those are private entities. They're here today. They could be gone in a few years. Twitter itself has had difficulty even finding a buyer for itself. Who knows how long it'll actually be around? But if the government steps in and begins regulating them as common carriers, as has been advocated, then they will get the protection of that regulation. And then we will have all kinds of problems of the government inserting itself in social media and dictating how much of one side or another side you need to be listening to, what is defamatory. There's a whole host of problems that could come from that kind of reaction, similar to how the government used to regulate the telecommunications industry and provided AT&T with a regulated monopoly. So that is not the path that we want to be going down. Unfortunately, both parties have been saying things in that regard, and this executive order is an example of that. But I hope that cooler heads prevail in the next Congress and future Congresses, and that we don't go down that road.
Zachary James Miller, you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I am very, very much in favor of free speech. I want as little censorship as possible. I think that journalists And
so you agree then that that tweet by Donald Trump should not be filtered?
No, I agree. I agree that basically a private company has the right to do whatever they want to do with their private company, and that if Twitter wants to fact check Donald Trump, I'm totally in favor of that. But what I'm saying is that I don't like the idea of government intrusion into what's to be said and what's not to be said, because some things that are controversial may be important to be said. And I like the idea that we have this free marketplace of ideas. I think my ideas are strong enough and good enough that if your ideas are totally opposite to mine, we can debate, that we can come up in this free exchange of ideas and have a debate. I remember when I was a child and I watched William F. Buckley interview and debate with Huey P. Newton, chairman of the Black Panthers. That was incredible. And this is the kind of exchange we had then. And right now we're afraid of the other's ideas. I think Tom Cotton is a vile human being who shouldn't be a senator. And he has proved it by things he's done and said for many years now in the Senate. But on the other hand, I think my ideas are better than his, and my ideas and the left's ideas are better than his, and they can go up in a debate against his ideas. And so I'm not afraid of Tom Cotton's ideas,
Because just to remind our viewers, Tom Cotton wrote a op-ed piece for the New York Times. It was published. It's created a furor. The editor of the editorials page of the New York Times has now resigned. You're saying that that piece where he says send in the troops, why not publish it? Is that what you're saying, Zachary?
Well, there's actually a difference here because, okay, there are things that, according to New York Times policy, that they can fact check him because he said things that are totally inaccurate, and they could have, on that basis, not allowed the article because there's no anarchy in the streets. So he said a lot of things that are totally inaccurate, and the fact that it wasn't looked at by the editor before it went online, that may be enough reason for him to have resigned. But on the other hand, I'm not afraid of Tom Cotton's ideas, and as long as the New York Times is presenting other ideas to refute what he said, as long as they have the possibility and the right and that they do fact check him, I'm okay with that. So I think censorship is a two-edged sword, and because I don't want my side to be unduly censored, I have to allow the other side to have their say. As long as we both have our say, that's incredibly important. That's what free speech is about in America, and I don't want us to lose that.
Davina Frau Meggs, in today's world, is that possible, what Zachary James Miller has just described?
Well, there are several things going on here. There is a fact-checking issue, and up to now, it's true that the social media had refused to apply any fact check on democratically elected politicians. We did an audition of Twitter and Facebook just a month ago at the French equivalent of the Federal Communications Commission, and they confirmed to us that they considered that even though the COVID crisis, for instance, was very problematic and had health issue and general interest issues at stake, they were refraining from fact-checking on political figures. But they were starting to consider this famous interstitial filter, which is a filter that allows Twitter in particular, to flag, as it has done, some news that are fact-checked, need to be fact-checked. They do it, Twitter does it on the idea that this contravenes the rules of its community. So it's doing it as a private sector media. And most media in America are commercial media. The problem that we've all had with fake news in particular, especially fake news coming from the right in America, is that Twitter, Facebook, etc., they are de facto our new public space. And can you leave the new public space totally unregulated for people to say things that are outrageously going against human dignity, against the freedom of others, with intimidation, which is what we're seeing now with Trump. I'm not sure. I think we need a public debate, and the public debate has been opened up. And it seems to me normal that we have contradictory versions until we reach some kind of status. The status that is being at stake is the status of those social media. Up to now, they're not recognized as social media. We've seen with fake news, we've seen with algorithms that there is some kind of editorial line behind these algorithms, and therefore, and that they are making their business model based, like all the other media, on advertising. And so you see Trump taking the lesson directly. He's saying, well, I want that order because that way the FTC will be able to prevent federal publicity and advertising to go to Twitter, hurt Twitter the way it can. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd want to draw attention to also is that in that executive order, he uses a very striking expression. He says the practice is un-American. And to me, that reeks back not of the 60s, but of the 50s, of witch hunt and McCarthyism, with the House on Un-American Activities that also conducted a series of censorship. So it's America revisiting its past and reshuffling the borders of what is tolerable and the Overton window. And Trump wants to take the lead on this change instead of letting it to his opponents on the Democratic side that have also said they would do something about fakes.
All right, let's get a couple of reactions. One person who's distanced himself as well from Twitter is the boss of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. Let's listen.
That I don't think that Facebook or internet platforms in general should be arbiters of truth. I think that's a kind of a dangerous line to get down to in terms of deciding what is true and what isn't.
Marie-André Weiss, is Facebook a publisher? And is it responsible for the content on its site as a result?
No, it's not. It's not under the law, and it's not under its own policy. I mean, it's obvious that Mark Zuckerberg is trying the hardest he can not to take that road, and it's a very difficult decision to take in a sense that Twitter took another route. He decided, I'm going to flag. He didn't delete the president's tweet, by the way. Just in a way participate in the marketplace of ideas by saying, posting under the president's tweet, pretending that there's going to be rampant fraud in California in November. They just said, no, get your facts. And it led to a page where you can actually get some facts, including a press release from the Office of the Governor of California explaining why he made the decision to allow every registered voter in California to vote by mail because, hey, we have COVID-19. So, and so the other tweet you mentioned in the beginning of the show is the tweet about violence and possibly the dog whistle which was heard probably by the president's base. And so that's the crux of the debate between EU and the US.
We've had, Marie-André, we've had the Facebook Analytica, the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've had the fact that Facebook, which at the time, again, flatly refused to see itself as a publisher, in the interest for itself of making money, not of getting Donald Trump elected, aided, unwittingly or not, in some underhanded tactics when it came to that 2016 election. Should regulation be a light touch, again, when it comes to social media?
Regulation, it can be law or it can be your own private regulation. So Twitter decided not to allow political ads. It's Jack Dorsey who explained that he would refuse to carry on political ad for the next election. And he cited, for instance, deep fakes, and he said it was a threat to democracy. And so Facebook could very well now make a decision, and he wouldn't have to wait for any law, executive order, or any sort, but because taking decision based on what you strongly believe. And Mark Zuckerberg probably doesn't want, I'm sure he doesn't want Donald Trump to be reelected, so he can decide, okay, I'm not carrying political election. And that would be a big step already towards keeping the next election, probably more democratic.
Here in Europe, we're taking a different attitude, it seems. We heard the European Commissioner in February for Digital Affairs, Thierry Breton. This is before all this latest spat with Twitter broke out. Here's what he had to say about Facebook.
Online platforms have a responsibility, an obvious responsibility towards our fellow citizens, towards all of us, towards those who are users of this technology, and also towards democracy. We do have a legislative vehicle in the form of the Digital Service Act, which will be presented at the end of the year and will contain measures that could be binding.
So, Davina Frau Meggs, will Europe regulate where the US doesn't?
I think we're coming together. First, I want to say that Facebook does exactly the same thing as Twitter, more actually. Facebook uses active moderation. It uses fact checkers and pays for fact checkers to flag and to de-rank content, etc. So I don't know what Mark Zuckerberg is talking about. I think he's trying politically not to be involved and save his skin there. But what we are all asking, I think, in America as well as in Europe, is not for the censorship or whatever. We're all asking for transparency, and especially transparency during election times and advertising transparency. This is what the Code of Conduct in Europe has asked, with moderation and with monitoring by several multi-stakeholders, so that it's not just one actor being judge and party, which is to say the platforms themselves. So I think the Americans are listening to this and they're finding it interesting, because transparency is not about censorship, it's about accountability.
Anthony Sanders, you agree with that?
I think that I can't speak to the approach of the European Union and whether that's a good approach for Europe, but I would encourage our European friends to follow what has been in their tradition in promoting and protecting free speech in the post-war era. I think
what
that
Davina is saying is bills that say yes, free speech can continue unabated, but at the same time, transparency as to when it comes to things like the algorithm and who's advertising, who's bankrolling the ads.
No, I don't think that private companies should be forced to disclose who is behind how they set their algorithm up. If people are disgusted with, say, how Facebook is presenting its news, and that say that there's more liberal news than conservative news, and somehow you can't get the truth to come to the front. People can share their own news amongst themselves. They can go to different platforms. Facebook is only one entity out there. There are other ways to get the news and to share the news. And I think if we went down that road, because Facebook is by means perfect and Twitter is by no means perfect. But if we go down that road and having the government say go into the algorithm and dictate what can be done, or to have to share that algorithm, and so therefore Facebook comes up with some different model that maybe is not as good for society, then we get into tuning the dials on exactly how free speech is being shared. And that's not a road I think we want to go down.
But Anthony, in 2016, there was cases, for instance, in Pennsylvania, where Facebook, because they were able to determine who the markets were, they were able to do micro advertising, targeting Black voters, telling them, if you want to, you can vote by SMS. Facebook ran these ads, and are you saying that should be allowed in 2020?
Well, I don't know that the exact specifics of those ads, but if we have ads that are false, And that, especially if we have ads that are defamatory in some way, the people who produce those ads can still be liable. Section 230, for example, is the president's order is about has nothing to do about whether the producers of ads can be liable or whether you can have speech to combat those ads. It's just about the carrier, Facebook, which you might analogize to a newspaper, you might analogize to an old-fashioned bookstore. It's whether the Facebook itself is liable. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of who is producing those ads is not shielded by the United States law. It's just who is carrying it.
Zachary James Miller, when you look ahead to the next presidential election, do you agree with Anthony?
I agree with Anthony in that I think that we need to look to the producer of the ads. So many times we look at, we have this blockage. We misdirect our anger. Right now, clearly, Mark Zuckerberg does not want to be the arbitrator of what is factual and what is not. They all have in place certain procedures to remove things. Maybe those need to be intensified that are clearly not factual, or that are attacking someone, or where someone could be prosecuted. But we need to point our fingers at those producers more so than the facility, the platform. In fact, the amount of traffic that these platforms get, I don't see how they could even do a good job at taking out everything that is wrong. But on the other hand, too, small political players like the progressives that I support have found their political viability through social media. I mean, we don't have the vast amount of money that Russians had in producing a lot of fake ads for the Trump campaign with the bots and everything. But still, those ads that progressives use through social media, I don't want them censored either. And also the idea of focusing not on these platforms rather than the actual producers of these things. That's the other thing. I was, watching all the hysteria around New York Times and Tom Cotton, but I'm wondering, why don't we direct our anger at Tom Cotton? Why aren't there people protesting right now in Tom Cotton's office talking about the First Amendment? That's where the energy should be going to.
All right, the message, not the messenger. There's another layer, though, with Facebook, and I think it's an important one. We have to mention it. There's the public part, but you also have private groups on WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, private groups as well on Facebook itself. There's outrage here in France over a private group among police officers that came to light last week. It's a France 2 report read by Monty Francis.
It's a private Facebook group at the center of controversy. With almost 8,000 members, the majority national or regional police officers in France. Although private, we got access to the site. Over a series of months, several racist and homophobic comments were discovered that could be punishable under French laws against hate speech. On these screen grabs obtained by the site Street Press, there are a barrage of discriminatory comments against black people, women, and gay people. Like this one, a play on words that equates black people with excrement. Friday, the French Interior Minister took legal action against a number of sites, prompting mixed reactions. Some people make bad comments, freedom of speech okay, but we are supposed to represent the law, and the law does not permit this. Another member said, if we become criminalized for saying racist things, I think Facebook would become a vast desert. Of the 8,000 members on the site, how many are racist? A police official who wanted to remain anonymous says the problem is pervasive.
Vous entendez, ce gouloul, oui, ce nègre, c'est devenu normal.
But for Abdullah Kante, who has worked in the Paris Police Department for 20 years, he says the problem is not systemic.
L'institution police n'est absolument pas raciste, mais il y a des comportements racistes qu'il faut effectivement dénoncer Nous devons être exemplaires envers la population.
Those who've made discriminatory comments on the site could face prosecution. More than 1,000 members of the group have unsubscribed in the past few days.
So, Davina Frau-Meggs, in this case, it's a private group. We're talking about free speech and all of this, but what do you do about that?
Well, in France, you indict the people because we have laws about hate speech. So for us, it's relatively clear. But again, what I want to say is that the private becomes public very fast. And it allows ideas that are small, that are really diminutive, that are not the majority, to have the same level of proficiency and of visibility as larger ideas of the larger community.
So they should be regulated.
Well, we should know how this happens. And so I say that there's no one solution. My favorite solution is self-regulation by the media themselves, but they will only do it if they feel the pressure, either from the public or from the regulatory authorities. And media literacy, which is to say educating people to this and knowing and telling them that whatever they put out there is public, even though they think it's private, and that this can have real-life consequences for them. So I think that's where I would stay at this level.
Anthony Sanders, do you consider a Facebook group that has 8,000 members as a private group?
I think it's a private group. Just if you had a convention of 800 people and they were sharing ideas at that convention, it would be a private group. And a private group online, in many ways, is the same as a private group offline, or a people meeting in a coffee house to share ideas, which we've had forever. What we shouldn't do is take a people sharing ideas online, and just because it is effective and just because we don't like those ideas, and it sounds like these ideas that were shared here were pretty detestful, that we can turn it into a subject of regulation. The moment we start doing that, then we do get down the road of, well, where we regulate what is public, what is private. Does everything in some sense become private, public? Does the public become anything that is political become public? And I could even see it going beyond the online world. Do we start regulating what people can say in conventions and coffee houses differently because we analogize it to what is online? So I think that is a dangerous road to go down. We've always had private groups discussing. Let them discuss. Let's defeat them in the marketplace of ideas. If they say something actually defamatory or they incite a riot, we can address that in ways that we've always been to address them under U.S. law and laws of other countries. But we shouldn't go down the road of starting to turn that into a public matter.
And that marketplace of ideas will be very active indeed between now and November in the United States. I want to thank you so much, Anthony Sanders, for joining us today from St. Paul, Minnesota. I want to thank Marie-André Weiss for being with us from St. Petersburg in Florida, Zachary James Miller, and Davina Frau-Meggs here in Paris. And we want to thank you for joining us in ever greater numbers on the France 24 debate and on our Facebook page, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.